guys, so today I'm going to make a video on the CSF flow or the cerebrospinal fluid flow. The CSF is a fluid that the brain makes to help itself get protected, clear its waste substances, and also give its nutrients. Now, the brain is a super smart organ, right? So it makes everything that it needs to keep itself going and running all the time. And it's also highly intricate, so you can see how its structures are very detailed, and even the tiniest structures has a very important function to help the body going whenever it needs to, right? Basically all the time. So without further delay, let's look at the CSF flow. And before we begin, I just want to make a quick note on where it is produced. So CSF is produced in the coronoid plexus, and it's produced by the ependymal cells. Okay, so now let's look at the flow. So you have the different ventricles. So ventricles are these hollow fluid-filled parts of the brain, and the various ventricles. You have the lateral ventricle, you have the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, and all these ventricles have the coronoid plexus, which produces the CSF by its ependymal cells, and once the cells produce the CSF, it's drained into these respective ventricles. So the third ventricle's coronoid plexus is going to produce the CSF via its ependymal cells, and it's going to get it drained to the third ventricle. Okay, and same with the lateral and the fourth ventricle. So let's begin. The journey starts with the lateral ventricle, because lateral ventricle is the ventricle that's at the most top part of the brain. And as you can see, this is a sagittal section of my brain. So my brain being cut into half. All right. So it starts from this lateral section, the lateral ventricle right here, and through the interventricular foramina, which is over here, right? Through the interventricular foramina, right here, I'm going to go into the third ventricle. So I'm going to start with the lateral ventricle. Through the interventricular foramina, I'm going to go into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, right, through the cerebral aqueduct, which is going to be over here, I'm going to move into the fourth ventricle right here. Okay, and the fourth ventricle is this hollow triangular part over here, just next to my cerebellum. From the fourth ventricle, I'm going to go through the lateral and medial appenditures, the lateral and medial appenditures, which is going to be here. Okay, lateral medial appenditures. I'm going to go to the subarachnoid space, which is right over here, and then from the subarachnoid space, I'm going to go to the arachnoid villi of the dural venous sinuses, and then from there, it's going to go and drain itself into the venous blood, and the venous blood is going to take it to the heart and lungs, and the arterial blood, once it gets oxygenated in the lungs, it's going to go back into my lateral third and fourth ventricle in the coronoid plexus, and again it's going to recycle. New CSF is going to be flowing, and again we're going to start from the lateral ventricle. Okay, all right, should we do another quick demonstration of this whole process again? Let's begin then. Start from the lateral ventricles, through the intraventricular foramina, third ventricle, from the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, which is right over here. I'm going to go all the way to my fourth ventricle, through the lateral and medial appenditures. I'm going to go to the subarachnoid space over here, and then from the subarachnoid space, arachnoid villi of dural and venous sinuses, into the venous blood, to the heart and lungs. Heart and lungs gets it oxygenated, with the arterial blood now going back to my various ventricles. Alrighty, thank you for listening and watching. Now let's look at 3 clinically relevant pathological scenarios in the flow of CSF. So we begin with an obstruction of the foramen of Monro or the interventricular foramina, which is right here. So you have an obstruction here in the CSF flow What's that going to do? Okay, so you have your three choices. A, is it going to cause a dilated lateral and third ventricle? Is it going to cause a dilated lateral ventricle? Or is it going to cause a dilated enlargement of all the four ventricles? Yes, it's going to cause a dilated lateral ventricle, because lateral ventricle is just before the foramen of Monro or the interventricular foramina. So just before the interventricular foramina, the CSF was in the lateral ventricle. So lateral ventricle enlargement or dilated lateral ventricle. Let's move on to the next one. What about if you have a case where you have an obstruction of the cerebral aqueduct? Right here, obstruction of the cerebral aqueduct. What is that going to lead to? What is just before the cerebral aqueduct? So if it cannot flow through, it cannot move forward to the fourth ventricle, it's going to cause a dilation of, so it's going to be backflow. The fluid is going to be obstructed. Where exactly? Yes, so it's going to be obstructing in all the structures just before the pathway. So it's going to be the third ventricle and the lateral ventricle. So you will have enlargement or dilated third ventricle and lateral ventricle. Now, what if you have obstruction of the Magendie Luschka or the medial and lateral appenditure? So these are different terms that we are using here. I'm purposely using these different terms because they might ask you these different terms. So lateral and medial appenditures that we looked at previously can also be referred to as Magendie and Luschka. So if you have an obstruction here, then you're going to have the CSF going back and being blocked at all the other fluid-filled hollowed spaces. Okay, and obviously there will be less fluid because the fluid is flowing, but it's going to be obstructed, so the fluid is going to get accumulated. So that's why you're going to get this dilation. So now you're going to have dilation not only in the fourth ventricle, you're going to have dilation in the third ventricle as well as the lateral ventricle. Okay, all right, so I hope this was helpful again. And remember the two new terms that we learned here. The medial and lateral appendicular is also called the foramen of Magendie and Luschka. The foramen of Monro is another term for interventricular foramina.